Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, honestly, a truly transformative period in ancient Indian history. We're talking about a stretch of about 500 years where the subcontinent's destiny was shaped not from its traditional heartland, but from the outside in. It was like a revolving door of conquerors, nomads, and kings, all pouring in from Central Asia and changing India forever.
So let's start with a huge question, one that really drives so much of history. What happens when a great empire falls? Well, a vacuum is created. And both nature and politics can't stand a vacuum. This is exactly what happened after the collapse of India's mighty Mauryan Empire. And that single event is what kicks off our entire story. Okay, so let's really get our bearings with this map. For centuries, the center of Indian power was way over here, in Magadha, deep in the Gangetic Plains. But once the Mauryas were gone, the focus shifts, and it shifts dramatically, all the way to the northwest. This region, what we'd now call Afghanistan and Pakistan, suddenly becomes the main stage. Why? Because it was the gateway to India, and that gate had just been kicked wide open. What came next was a whole new era, one that was really defined by the succession of dynasties pouring in from Central Asia. Now, don't get me wrong, native dynasties like the Shungas and the Satavahanas were rising up in the east and central parts of India, but the northwest, that was a completely different story, a whole other ballgame. And who were the first ones through that open gate? The Greeks. Now, we're not talking about Alexander the Great's army from a century before. No, these were their descendants, the Indo-Greeks of Bactria. And you can think of them as the trailblazers. They were the ones who were going to set a totally new precedent for what it even meant to be a king in India. Now, that might sound like a pretty simple statement, but believe me, its impact was absolutely revolutionary. Before the Indo-Greeks came along, power in India was, for the most part, pretty anonymous. But they were about to change all that, and they did it using a small, simple, but incredibly powerful piece of technology. And here it is. The contrast on this slide is just fantastic. Before this, Indian coins were these kind of crude, punch-marked pieces of metal. They were functional, sure, but totally impersonal. The Indo-Greeks introduced coins that were basically miniature billboards for the king. I mean, for the very first time, you could hold a piece of currency that had the actual portrait of the guy in charge right there with his name. It was a brilliant way to stamp your authority across a huge, diverse kingdom. And of all these Greek kings, the most famous by far was Menander, who was also known as Melinda. He ruled this massive territory from his capital at Sakala, which is modern-day Sialkot. But here's the thing. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a deep thinker. He famously got into this incredible philosophical debate with a Buddhist sage named Nagasena, and their conversation was so profound that it was written down in this classic text, the Milinda Panho. Menander actually ended up embracing Buddhism, which just goes to show how these new rulers weren't just conquering India, they were also being profoundly shaped by it. So the Greeks kicked the door open, but right on their heels, a new wave was coming. And these weren't city-dwelling Greeks. No. These were nomadic tribes from the vast steppes of Central Asia, the Shakas and the Parthians. Their job, you could say, was to consolidate and expand on the territories the Greeks had first carved out. So how in the world did they end up in India? Well, it's this incredible story, like a massive chain reaction, a huge domino effect that started hundreds and hundreds of miles away. It begins with the Chinese building their Great Wall. This puts pressure on a tribe called the Yuchi, pushing them west. The Yuchi then literally crash into the Shakas, forcing them out of their homeland. The Shakas then get pushed first into Parthian territory in Iran, but there's no room for them there, so where do they go? They spill over into India. It's just an amazing reminder of how interconnected the ancient world really was. Now, if you've just taken over a vast new territory, how do you actually rule it? You need a system. And the Shakas and Parthians brought one with them that they borrowed from the Persians, the satrap system. It's pretty clever. You just divide your empire into provinces, or satrapies, and put a governor, a satrap, in charge of each one. This let them manage a really huge and diverse population pretty effectively. And just like the Greeks, the Shakas started to get deeply involved in Indian culture. And the most powerful example of this comes from a ruler named Rudradaman I. Around the year 150 AD, he ordered this long public inscription to be carved at Junagadh. And the language he chose for it? It wasn't his own native tongue. It wasn't Greek, the administrative language of the time. No, he chose chaste, high-level, classical Sanskrit. It was the first time this had ever been done on such a scale, and it was a huge signal that these so-called foreign rulers were embracing Indian high culture in a big way. All right, so we've had the Indo-Greeks, the trailblazers. We've had the Shakas, the consolidators. The next wave to come through that revolving door, well, they were the main event. These were the Kushans, and they weren't just invaders or consolidators. These guys were true empire builders. They created one of the great, and I mean great, empires of the ancient world. And when I say empire, I'm not kidding. Just look at the scale of this thing. The Kushan Empire was enormous. It stretched all the way from Central Asia right up near the borders of China, down through Afghanistan and Pakistan, and deep into the Gangetic Plains of India. We're talking about a territory that covered parts of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and of course northern India. This wasn't some regional kingdom. It was a genuine global superpower of its time. And these two images here, man, they perfectly illustrate the whole Kushan phenomenon. On the right, you've got this famous headless statue of their greatest king, Kanishka. But look at what he's wearing: a heavy tunic, an overcoat, thick boots. This is the gear of a Central Asian horseman, not a traditional Indian king. And then on the left, that's an image of the Buddha from the Gandhara school, an art style that absolutely flourished under Kushan patronage. Kanishka was a passionate Buddhist, and it was under his rule that this new, human-like depiction of the Buddha really took off. A Central Asian king championing a brand new vision for an Indian religion. Incredible. Kanishka's legacy is so huge, it's not just in stone, it's in time itself. In the year 78 AD, he started an era, a way of counting the years. And this isn't just some dusty historical factoid. Get this, this era, which we now call the Shaka era, is so foundational that it is still officially used by the government of India today for its national calendar. Just think about that for a second. More than 1,900 years later, Kanishka's mark on time endures. So you might be wondering, where did the money come from to build and run this massive empire? Well, the Kushans were basically sitting on a geographic gold mine. Their empire was positioned perfectly astride the legendary Silk Road. That means every caravan loaded with precious silk heading from China to Rome had to pass right through their territory. And you better believe the Kushans collected tolls, making them unbelievably wealthy and powerful. Okay, so let's take a breath and zoom out. After 500 years of these successive dynasties, the Greeks, the Shakas, the Kushans, what was the grand total? What was the cumulative impact on India? Well, it was so much more than just a change in rulers. It was a fundamental reshaping of politics, of warfare, of religion, and of culture itself. Let's start with politics. They brought in a whole new toolkit for governance. We already talked about the satrap system, but they also introduced things like hereditary dual rule, where a father and son would rule together to ensure a smooth succession. They brought in the Greek idea of military governors, or strategos, and crucially, they really pushed the idea of divine kingship. Kushan rulers started using titles like Devaputra, which means son of God, to make it clear their authority came from a higher power. Their impact on the battlefield was just as massive. I mean, these guys came from Central Asia, they were master horsemen. They brought better cavalry and the large-scale use of horses into Indian warfare. And with them came all the gear of a mounted warrior: the turban, the tunic, trousers, boots. But most importantly, the saddle and the stirrup. This was an absolute game changer. A firm saddle and a pair of stirrups meant a rider could stay on his horse during intense combat, and crucially, he could use the full momentum of a charging horse to deliver a devastating lance thrust. It basically turned cavalry from a light scouting force into the ancient world's version of heavy tanks. And what about religion and belief? This is where things get really fascinating. This period saw this incredible fusion of faiths. We've talked about the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, which rulers like Kanishka heavily supported. But it wasn't an exclusive thing. If you look at Kushan coins, you'll find not just the Buddha, but Hindu gods like Shiva, right alongside Greek and Zoroastrian deities. We even have stone inscriptions telling us about Greek officials like Heliodorus adopting Vaishnavism and putting up pillars to honor Krishna. It was a time of amazing religious pluralism. So all of this blending and mixing of people and ideas, well, it led to a massive creative explosion. You see the birth of two of India's most famous schools of art, Gandhara and Mathura, creating these amazing new styles that mixed Indian subjects with Greco-Roman and Central Asian techniques. In literature, we see the very first Sanskrit plays being written, and in science, Greek ideas in astronomy and medicine started to mix with and enrich India's own traditions of knowledge. And let's look a little closer at that, because this table really shows that blend beautifully. In astronomy, you get the introduction of Harashahastra, a word that comes directly from the Greek horoscope. In coin-making, while the beautiful portrait coins themselves are a direct testament to Greek and Roman influence. But at the exact same time, this era also produces the Charaka Samhita, which is a foundational text of purely indigenous Ayurvedic medicine. It was a period of both borrowing from the outside and incredible local innovation.
But you know how these things go. No empire lasts forever. The Kushan era eventually came to an end. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, a powerful new dynasty, the Sasanians from Iran, started attacking their western territories. The great revolving door of the northwest began to slow down, and the decline of the Kushans would ultimately clear the stage for the rise of the next great native Indian empire. Which brings us to our final thought. The story of these 500 years is a story of constant motion, of interaction, of borrowing and blending. It really challenges this whole idea of a static, unchanging, pure culture. It forces us to ask the question, is any culture, anywhere in the world, ever truly pure? Or is it always the product of a dynamic and, sometimes disruptive conversation with the world outside its borders? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.